Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Seth Meyers, clinical psychologist. I'm going to talk in this video about an issue that I know affects many different people, many different families, and that is an issue around mother in laws. Now, a lot of times people talk about having a mother in law or who the mother in law is in a very negative way. In fact, you may hear the term monster in law, people talking about having the most difficult mother in law imaginable. They can turn this kind of mother in law into a caricature as if she is evil or possessive or controlling and really kind of like a human nightmare to deal with. Now, is that the case? Or a lot of times, is this a stereotype that is really unfair? In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about when there is a problem in the mother in law relationship. Now, I want to just start with the question: should there be some degree of tension to be expected anytime there is a relationship with an in law parent? I would suggest that some degree of tension is possible, and maybe even a little awkwardness or tension should be expected in the very beginning. Why? Because we are talking about blending families. Blending families is a very complex process. So, when you think about one person, one member of a couple, they come from a family. And that family has operated in a certain way for many, many, many years. There have been certain unspoken and some spoken rules that family lives by. And there are certainly rules and expectations that parents and their children have in those families. Well, when that adult child makes the decision later to get married to someone else, then all of a sudden two families are really forced to blend. And anytime you get two families together and you blend them, there is always the possibility for some tension, even some conflict. So, if anybody walks into a marriage and plans to blend two families and thinks automatically that it will go well, they may not be thinking realistically. So I think the first point is to talk about having realistic expectations that blending families is not an easy thing to do, that blending families can bring tension and conflict. And yet, we can figure out ways to make that transition smoother, to make everyone feel as respected as possible in that transition. We'll talk more about that in the video that focuses on the solution, how to fix any kind of problems or issues when there is a problem in the mother in law relationship. But in this video, the main purpose of it is just to highlight and identify what the problem may look like in the mother in law relationship. I shared a little bit about what kind of goes into creating the problem, and it stems from blending families, and everyone can probably understand that. Now, if there is a problem in the mother in law relationship, a lot of times it relates to a mother in law being really overprotective. The mother in law may have set ideas about how they believe the new in law child should behave, should act. And a lot of times there are specific areas that the mother in law may have particular problems with, and that tensions and conflicts may arise. And one of the main ones has to do with childcare. One problem is that the mother in law may have very specific thoughts or recommendations about how the grandchild should be cared for. What is the best way to parent? And, this really relates to a kind of general category of unsolicited advice. And I actually do in another video, a whole video on unsolicited advice, because my feeling about unsolicited advice is that, we've all had enough of it. That really most people, unless there are issues around real, life or death safety, most people will serve themselves better and their relationships to keep their advice to themselves, or at least to ask the individual before they give the advice, hey, would you be open to me sharing a little advice? So, whenever you have a mother in law who is really kind of dishing out advice on how the grandchild should be treated, how the grandchild should be parented, fed, all kinds of things, that's unsolicited advice. And it's really often going to create a conflict. So, although the intention may be really good of the mother in law, that they care, it doesn't really matter. Although the intention may be good on the part of the mother in law really will not serve themselves well or the relationship if they end up causing their own child or the other in law to become angry, to become defensive. These kinds of problems can really snowball and escalate. And so, just one little example of this can build on another previous example, and the resentment can start to grow. Another problem that happens when a mother in law does something that feels like a violation, steps over a line in the eyes of their child or their other in law, is these things happen, these trespasses happen, and they are remembered. They are remembered. So, although a mother in law may do something just one time, or maybe even two times, and that may seem like a small number, it doesn't matter if those specific instances are remembered and held onto, and a lot of times they will be brought up in arguments or fights maybe 5 years later. People need to remember to be very careful, because even one trespass like that, if it feels like a real insult or offense to the person that's receiving it, it will be held on to, because everyone really is trying to protect their own sense of self, their own sense of them doing what's right and what's good and what's decent. So when somebody does something that really hurts us or violates us in some ways, we remember it, and we remember it so that we don't end up feeling hurt by that same person in that same way again. So in these situations, when the mother-in-law feels tempted to want to say something or want to do something or overstep, she must be very, very, very careful. She must pause and ask herself, hold on, is it worth it? Is this something that actually, if I say it, might cause a conflict, and that conflict might be remembered and held on to, not just for months, but even for years to come? Maybe. So pause, pause, pause. Now, a lot of times people will talk about a mother in law, I think, in a way that is a stereotype, that is unfair and not true. In general, when it comes to men and women, I often find when it comes to relationship issues, women get treated really unfairly. Women get talked about in a really unfair way, in a way that the men don't necessarily get talked about. So I believe that talking about a mother in law in this way, as if she is a monster, or what you'll hear a lot of times is that she is so possessive and she is so controlling and she doesn't want anyone near her child, is that actually is really not the truth. That she is not being possessive, that this is not necessarily about control. This, I believe, is a way for that mother in law to be caring, to try to protect. This is, in a way, how responsible she feels to protect and to love her child, and in some cases, her grandchildren when there are grandchildren involved. Is it malicious? I believe it is usually not malicious. Is the intention positive? Yes. One of the things that we need to remember when we marry into another family, and now there are two families blended, when you take the mother in law, you are talking a lot of times about someone who has been responsible for that child. A lot of times, if it's the biological parent, since birth. A lot of times, if it is someone who is adopted, from the age that they are very, very, very young. And that parent has felt nervous and anxious the whole life of that child to try to take care of them and protect them against a world that is really complex and where a lot of times bad things happen. So, where does this sense of this controlling mother in law come from? It comes a lot of times from that mother in law's sense of love and responsibility for that child. A lot of times, people engage in feelings and operate from whole belief systems that make total sense from an emotional standpoint, and yet actually they don't make sense anymore. So while it may have made sense when that child was 5 or 10 or 15 to worry that way, to want to protect to that degree, it's not necessary in the same way when that mother in law's child is 25, 30, 35, even older. But you know what? Those are patterns. These are habits that mothers in law have of loving, of caring, and protecting that make it very difficult sometimes to just turn that switch and say, well, now I understand. I understand that they've married someone else. I understand that they are older. I understand that they live this independent life now. They can understand it logically a lot of times, but sometimes the love and the sense of responsibility of a parent is so strong and even so primitive that it becomes very difficult to turn that switch off and to really let go in that way. So I've talked a little bit about from the perspective of the mother-in-law's behavior, but a lot of times it's the daughter-in-law or the son-in-law that may have some of their own emotional issues around the mother-in-law that need to be looked at more carefully. I believe in relationships, it's rarely the fact that one person is good and one person is bad, except in cases of abuse. A lot of times, there are examples where each person bears some responsibility in either starting a conflict or maintaining a conflict or repeating conflicts. I believe that we all serve ourselves better and our relationships better if we can all accept a little responsibility for maybe how a negative pattern in a relationship got started. If there is a problem between the in law child and the mother in law, it's probably a safer assumption to say that each person over time may have done certain things that have continued the problem. And again, we'll talk more about that in the next video, the mother in law solution when there is a problem in that relationship. But I just want to spend a minute, though, talking about the daughter in law or the son in law. They too can engage in behaviors that can seem very protective of their own turf. A daughter in law or a son in law, when they get married and they set up a house, they are starting a new life with someone. When we think about childhood, let's just say it's 0 to 18, so much of that childhood is all geared towards getting ready to start living life as an adult. So then, fast forward, once you are that person living an adult life and you make the adult decision to set up a house with someone that you are in a relationship with, you decide to get married, you decide to create that new house. That is a very emotionally intense experience. You have spent your whole life getting ready to start living your life as an adult and to set up your adult life in this way. So there feels like there is a lot at stake for those men and women who are setting up that house, who are setting up that new relationship. There are a lot of fantasies involved. There's the fantasy that this relationship may last forever, hopefully. There is the sense that this will be a good home that we create. This will be a safe home. This will be a sanctuary. We are starting this relationship anew, and it will be a good one for years, decades to come. There's a lot of emotional intensity as a result of setting up a home like that. So when you think about how that daughter in law or son in law may feel about a mother in law who wants to be very involved in the life of their child still, even though they're an adult now. Well, a lot of times that can feel like mother in law is encroaching on their space, on their turf. They may misperceive some of the behaviors of the mother in law. Mother in law may simply want to maintain a relationship, may even want to develop a sense of closeness with the daughter in law or the son in law. But a lot of times the daughter in law or the son in law may feel like, wait a minute, we are trying to focus on setting up our life here. It needs to be just the two of us. The mother in law can be misperceived sometimes as being a threat in a way that they may not be. It's really important for the daughter in law or the son in law in these situations to check their own emotional reactions and make sure that they are not misperceiving some of the intentions of that mother in law. Now, rather than talk about all of these anxieties or issues with their actual married partner, it may be a good idea to talk to some friends of the daughter in law or son in law and just run some of these issues by them. Take a poll of a few friends and mention some things that are going on, some things that are being said, and make sure that you are not being overly emotionally reactive. I also just want to take a moment and talk about the sense of the parenting issue from the perspective of the daughter in law or the son in law. If you are a daughter in law or son in law and feel like you have a mother in law who is overstepping and making recommendations about how a child that you may have together may be parented, that is really understandable. That is normal. And most people would feel that same way. In those moments, the number one thing that you need to do when it happens is to make sure you don't react too quickly with saying or doing anything, or even making a negative face. Even making a simple negative face or giving someone, so to speak, the side eye can actually just create a conflict in itself. And then that mother in law may remember that situation. And then again, that may just accumulate some of the resentment between you and the mother in law. It is totally normal if you feel frustrated, if you feel like you're on the receiving end of unsolicited advice. There's a great quote that I've heard people say, and I think that it can be very helpful. One is, do I want to be right or do I want to be happy? That is a saying that can be very helpful in a moment when someone is giving you unsolicited advice, especially if it is a mother in law talking about how you should either run your home or parent your child. In the next video, I'm going to go deeper into the solution and specific things that you can do to improve or repair a fractured mother in law relationship. If this video has been helpful to you, please like this video. That way it gives me a sense of what you find helpful. But overall, I just want you to know that there is hope for these kinds of problems. If you feel frustrated, overwhelmed, or trapped in any way, feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm married into this family and I wish I hadn't, I just want to let you know that you may be feeling that way now, but feelings are not facts and feelings don't last forever, the bad ones or the good ones. So these feelings can change. We can work through these feelings and find a better way to deal with this going forward. I also just want to do a quick shout out. If you find this kind of video helpful, you can also check out the weekly mental health podcast, Insight with Dr. Seth. And you can check us out on Instagram, Insight Dr. Seth Podcast. And I wish you all the best.